Chapter 1. The Cathedral of Rotten Pine. The Pacific Northwest doesn't just have forests. It has cathedrals of wood and damp decay. Clara Vance sat at the center of one, huddled inside a cabin that felt like it was being slowly swallowed by the hungry earth. The air inside was a stagnant, suffocating cocktail of old paper, cold coffee, and the sharp, metallic tang of the Hermes 3000 typewriter. It was a machine built for war, heavy, ironclad, and uncompromising. Right now, Clara was losing that war. She was a prestige author, the kind people read on long-haul flights to feel intellectually superior, but for 2 long years, she had been nothing but a hollow shell. Her last book had been a masterpiece of trauma, a visceral dissection of human suffering, but the price of writing it had been her own sanity. Every sentence she had sold to the public was a piece of her mind she couldn't get back. Now, the heavy silence of the lake outside was a mocking echo of the silence in her brain. Every time she closed her eyes, she didn't see plots or characters. She saw the gray, murky water of the Columbia River where her childhood had ended in a scream. Just one word, she whispered to the darkness. Her voice was rasping, like dry leaves on pavement, from weeks of total disuse. Her reflection in the darkened window was a ghost, pale skin stretched over sharp, skeletal cheekbones, and eyes that looked like bruised, overripe fruit. She reached for the keys. The metal was frigid, biting into her fingertips. The killer didn't use a blade, she typed. The sound of the striker hitting the paper was like a gunshot in the small, cramped room. He used the victim's own secrets, sharpening them until they could slice through a life like silk. He stood in the shadows of the hallway, a silhouette carved out of the total absence of light, watching her sleep. He knew that by dawn, she wouldn't be a person anymore. She would be a monument to everything she had tried to forget. He felt the weight of her history in his hands, and it felt like power. Clara pulled her hands back as if the keys had burned her. The prose was too visceral, too close to the bone. She didn't remember thinking of those words. It felt like they had flowed through her fingers from the machine itself, as if the Hermes 3000 was a medium for some dark, subterranean signal. Chapter 2. The Silver Relic from the Deep. The first anomaly occurred at exactly 2:14 a.m. The world outside the cabin was a void of swirling mist and obsidian water. Clara was in the kitchen, paralyzed, staring at the blue, flickering flame of the stove. She was trying to remember the last time she had eaten something that wasn't out of a tin or a plastic bag. Her hunger had been replaced by a thin, vibrating anxiety. Thud. The sound was heavy, wet, and rhythmic. It didn't sound like a branch. It sounded like a body. Clara's heart surged, a frantic, panic drum against her ribs. She grabbed a steak knife from the counter, a pitiful, desperate protection against the vast, ancient darkness outside. She crept toward the door, her bare feet silent on the cold linoleum. "Who's there?" she called out. Her voice was thin and brittle, easily swallowed by the roaring wind. She peered through the glass pane. Nothing, only the mist, which looked like restless spirits dancing on the porch. But then, her eyes caught a sharp and natural glint of moonlight. On the railing, perfectly centered as if placed by a jeweler, sat an object that should have been at the bottom of a lake 300 miles away, buried under 20 years of silt. Clara opened the door, the biting chill of the mountain air instantly numbing her skin. She picked the object up. It was a silver fountain pen, heavy, tarnished, and freezing to the touch. On the barrel, an elegant, looped script of a long-dead engraver, was the name Sophie. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Sophie, her little sister. The girl who had walked into the dense woods 20 years ago and simply ceased to exist. Clara had given her that pen for her 12th birthday, a reward for her first short story. It was the last thing Sophie had been clutching when she disappeared. "This is impossible," Clara hissed, her breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. She looked out into the wall of trees. Who are you? Did you find this in the mud? Show yourself, you coward. Silence. Not a leaf stirred. The kind of silence that feels like it's holding its breath while it watches you bleed. She retreated inside, slamming the door and locking the deadbolt with trembling hands. She ran back to the typewriter, desperate to record the terror, to turn the fear into fiction so she could control it. But when she reached the desk, the page she had started was gone. A fresh, blindingly white sheet sat in the carriage. In the center, typed in a deep, thick, arterial red ink, was a single sentence. The water is cold, Clara, but the ink is colder. Do you remember the sound of the splash when the weight was finally tied to her ankles? Chapter 3. The Anatomy of a Cold Case. Clara didn't sleep. She couldn't. She spent the rest of the night crouched in the corner of the living room, the silver pen in her left hand and the steak knife in her right. She watched the shadows of the pines stretch and crawl across the ceiling like skeletal fingers. By dawn, the memory of Sophie's disappearance was no longer a dull ache. It was a living, breathing monster. She remembered the search parties. She remembered the dogs howling at the edge of the ravine. And she remembered her parents' eyes, the way they looked at Clara as if she was the one who had made the wrong choice, the one who had let go of Sophie's hand. Sheriff Miller arrived at 8 a.m. He was a man who looked like he was made of cracked leather and decades of bad news. He stood in her kitchen, his presence dwarfing the small space, sipping the coffee she had offered with a look of profound weariness. "It's a nice pen, Miss Vance," Miller said, turning the silver relic over in his calloused, nicotine-stained fingers. "Antique. Worth a bit on the market, I reckon. But you saying it belonged to a dead girl? That's a heavy claim to make before the sun's even fully up." "She isn't dead, Sheriff. She's missing," Clara snapped, her nerves frayed to the point of breaking. "And that pen was in a locked safety deposit box in my apartment in Seattle. I haven't opened it in 5 years. Now it's on my porch in the middle of a national forest. Someone is stalking me." Miller sighed, a sound like sandpaper on a coffin lid. "Look, I've read your books. You've got a vivid imagination. Maybe too vivid. You're out here alone. No internet, no people. Stress does things to the mind. Maybe you brought it with you in a daze, hidden in a pocket. Memory is a tricky, fragile thing when you're grieving. I am not grieving in a way that makes me teleport physical objects across state lines." Clara shrieked. "Someone is playing a game. Look at the typewriter. Look at that red ink. It's still wet." Miller walked over to the desk, his boots heavy on the floor. He peered at the sentence about the splash. "Red ink. Strange choice for a draft. But I don't see any signs of a struggle outside. No footprints in the mud. No broken branches. Just you, the trees, and a whole lot of silence." Miss Vance, as he turned to leave, his hand brushed against the doorframe. Clara noticed something that made her heart stop. Miller adjusted his uniform jacket, and for a split second, the white cuff of his shirt was visible. There was a smear on it, a bright, wet, viscous red smear. It was the exact same shade as the ink on her paper. Chapter 4. The script of the scene. She watched his cruiser pull away, the red tail lights disappearing into the thick gray mist like the eyes of a retreating predator. She didn't think. She just ran to the Hermes 3000. Her fingers moved with a life of their own, hammering the keys with such force that the bell chimed like a funeral knell. "The sheriff walked with the gait of a man carrying a heavy corpse," she typed. He didn't see the blood on his cuff because he was too busy smelling the rot in his own heart. He thought he could bury the truth in the silt of the lake, but the water was rising. He would be the first to drown in the chapter of reckoning. He felt the cold iron of the secret pressing against his ribs, and he knew the writer was finally looking at him. She stopped, horrified. She hadn't consciously composed a single word of that. But as she grabbed her binoculars and looked through the window at the distant road, she saw Miller's cruiser swerve. It didn't crash, but it jerked violently to the left, then the right, as if the driver had suddenly lost control of his own muscles. The realization hit her like a physical blow to the stomach. The story wasn't just predicting the future, it was dictating it. She was holding the leash of reality. She looked at the silver pen. It seemed to be glowing with a faint, sickly, rhythmic luminescence. She picked it up and realized the reservoir was empty. When she pressed the sharp nib against the pad of her thumb, it didn't just scratch her, it drank. A drop of her own blood was pulled into the silver barrel, and the pen hummed in her hand. "You want the truth?" she whispered to the shadows. "Fine, let's write the end of Sophie Vance." Chapter 5. The arrival. The afternoon was a fever dream of ink and blood. Clara began to type the most dangerous scene she had ever conceived. She described the knock. Not a human knock, but the hollow sound of bone on ancient wood. She described the smell of the lake, thick, mossy, and heavy with the scent of things that have been dead for a generation. Sophie stood at the threshold. Clara typed, her eyes streaming with tears of pure exhaustion and terror. She was the ink made flesh, a creature born of silver and cold water. She didn't want an apology. She didn't want flowers.